Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Dear all, I am Hassan Zada and today we will discuss operating current asset financing policies or financing operating current assets. Investment in operating current asset must be financed, or in other words, current assets must be financed, and the current asset can be financed through two main sources. One is the current liabilities and the second is the long-term liabilities. The current liabilities include bank loan, credit from suppliers, and accrued liabilities, whereas the long-term liabilities include long-term debts and common equity. Once when we acquire funds through raising these liabilities, then it can be invested in assets. It can be invested in fixed asset, and it can also be invested in current assets. If we look to this balance sheet, this side is the equity and liability side. This is the equity, this is the long-term debt, and this is the total long-term fund by adding equity and long-term debts. So this portion is known as long-term fund, whereas the current liabilities include note payables, account payables, and short-term bank loan. When we sum up, then it is known as short-term funds. So equity and liability side, this is the equity and liability side, and this is the asset side. Assets are divided in two groups. One is current asset and the second is one is fixed asset and the second is current asset. According to the balance sheet equation, asset is always the total of the asset, fixed asset plus current asset. Total of asset total asset is always equal to equity plus liability. This is long-term funds, this is short-term fund. When we add it, it is exactly it become exactly this figure. So equity and liability side is equal to total of the asset sides. Most business experience seasonal fluctuations. Seasonal fluctuation means that their sale increase in one season and it may decrease in the other season when the season is off. For example, if you consider the soft drink business tend to peak season in summer, so their sales increases in summers because soft drink industry have peak season in summer and off season is winter, so their sales decrease in winter. Similarly, if we consider the electric appliances such as electric heaters have peak season in winters because because people consume heaters in winter, so their sales increase in winter season. Whereas off season is summer. In summer, no one use heaters, therefore their sales decrease. In peak season or boom season, in peak season or boom season, company acquire operating current assets such as inventories and receivables. The In boom season or in peak season, the every organization increase their current asset because every organization need more and more inventories, so their receivable also increase. But in during off season or recession, operating current asset, the requirement for operating current assets such as inventories or receivable decreases. However, current asset really drop to zero. Companies must maintain permanent operating current assets even during the off season as well. So what is operating current asset? Which are the operating current asset needed even through off season of the business. So the current asset that are even needed during the off season of the business are known as permanent current asset or permanent level of current assets. Similarly, when sale increase during peak seasons, current assets are increased. When sale increase during the peak season, current assets are increased beyond the permanent operating current asset. So the extra current assets are defined as temporary current operating assets which are over and above permanent operating current assets. So the way permanent and temporary current assets are financed is known as firm operating current asset financing policies, and there are three operating current asset financing policies. The first one is moderate approach or maturity matching approach, or self-liquidating approach, or hedging approach. Second is relatively aggressive approach, and the third is conservative approach. So the first is moderate approach or maturity matching approach. And if we look to this diagram, on the vertical axis, the vertical axis there are assets, while on the horizontal axis there is time period. Time period year 1, year 2 are with the passage of time. So this is the fixed level. These are the fixed assets. And this level is the permanent current assets. So permanent current assets which are required throughout the year. Fixed assets are also required throughout the year. Therefore, permanent current assets as well as fixed assets are known as total permanent current assets. Whereas temporary current assets, this portion is the temporary portion of current assets, which are only required when sale increase in the peak season. So how the permanent current assets are financed, and how the temporary current assets are financed in maturity matching approach. We will discuss it with this balance sheet. If we look to the long-term funds, the total of long-term funds are 1120,000 and short-term funds are 600,000. So the total financing, long-term finance and short-term finance, are equal to 1720,000. Whereas the amount of total current asset is 720,000 and amount of fixed asset is 1,100,000. So it means that out of the 1120,000, the long-term assets, the long-term financing, out of the total long-term financing, 1,100,000 is invested in the fixed assets, and the remaining 120,000 is invested in current assets. The amount of the current asset is 720,000. It means that 600,000 is financed through the current liabilities. Out of 720,000 of total current asset, 120,000 is financed or purchased through the amount of the long-term funds. So 120,000 is invested in long-term. 120,000 of long-term fund is invested in current assets, whereas the remaining 600 of the current assets comes from the current liabilities that are raised through the current liabilities. So in maturity matching approach says that fixed asset, all of the fixed assets and permanent level of the current assets are financed with long-term funds. Here permanent level of the current asset is 120,000. We have considered that permanent current asset level is 120,000 and remaining current assets are temporary current assets. So the total current assets are 720,000. So one out of 720,000, 120,000 are the permanent current asset and remaining 600,000 are the temporary current assets. So if we discuss the maturity matching approach says that all of the fixed asset 1,10,000,000 and permanent level of the current asset, that is 120,000, is financed through the long-term funds through the amount that is raised through equity and long-term debts, whereas the rest of the temporary current asset in this case is 600,000, are financed through current liability. So this is the definition of maturity matching approach, which says that fixed asset, all of the fixed asset plus permanent current asset are financed through long-term funds, and temporary current asset are financed through short-term funds. So long-term funds of 1120,000 is used to finance 1 million of fixed asset, and the remaining long-term funds are invested in current asset. Which is 120,000, which is 120,000, and the remaining current asset are financed through short-term funds, which is indicated from this figure. So the amount of this figure fixed asset is 1 million, and the permanent current asset there in this case is 120,000, are financed through long-term funds, while this variation, these are the temporary current asset, and all of the temporary current asset are financed through the current liabilities. The next is relative aggressive approach. Relative aggressive approach says that, this is the definition of the relative aggressive approach. Relative aggressive approach says that the temporary current asset, all of the temporary current asset are financed with short-term funds, and relative portion of the permanent current assets or even relative portion of the fixed assets are financed through short-term funds. And the remaining short-term funds are financed with long-term funds, and the remaining are financed with long-term funds. This is the case. If we look to this example, this diagram, these are the fixed asset plus the permanent assets are divided in two categories. One is below the dash line and one is above the dash line. So in relative aggressive approach, all of the temporary current assets are financed through current liabilities, whereas some portion of the permanent asset is also financed through current liabilities. Some portion of the permanent current asset is also financed through short-term liabilities, whereas some portion of the permanent current asset and all of the fixed assets, and some portion of the permanent current assets and fixed assets are financed through long-term funds. It can be explained through this example. If we look to the balance sheet, the total long-term funds are 1120,000 and short-term liabilities are 600,000. So fixed asset, the amount invested in fixed asset is 1320,000, whereas the current asset consists of total of 400,000. It means that 1320,000 of total fixed assets, 1120,000 are financed through long-term equity, and out of the current liability of total 600,000, 400 are invested in the current asset and remaining 200 are invested in the long-term asset or in fixed assets. So here in this approach, what we have actually done, all of the fixed assets are financed through long-term funds. Here all of the fixed assets are financed through long-term funds, whereas some portion of the current asset, some portion of the permanent current asset, in this the total current asset are 400,000, out of which 120,000 is the permanent level of current assets. So the liabilities of 600,000 are raised, which are invested out of this 600,000, 120,000 is invested in the permanent current asset, while the remaining 280,000 is also invested in the temporary current assets. So this 400 consists of two things: one, permanent level of current asset, and temporary level of current asset. The permanent level of current asset is 120,000, whereas temporary level of current asset is the remaining over and above 120,000, which is 280,000 is the temporary current assets. So all of the permanent current assets 120,000 plus temporary current asset 280,000 are financed through through current liabilities, whereas 200,000 are of current liabilities are also invested in the long-term funds. This is the case of the relative aggressive approach. We call it a relative approach because the aggressiveness when the short-term funds when more level of the permanent current assets are financed with the short-term funds, the aggressiveness increase. In the extreme aggressiveness level, even the fixed assets are financed through the current liabilities, and this is the case of the extreme aggressiveness, in which even the fixed assets are also financed with the current assets. The third and the last approach is the conservative approach. What actually the conservative approach says? The conservative approach says that all of the fixed asset plus permanent current assets and the relative portion of the temporary current asset, it means all of the fixed assets plus all of the permanent current asset plus some portion of the temporary current asset are financed through long-term liabilities, and relative portion, the remaining relative portion of the temporary current asset are financed with short-term funds, and this is the case. Total long-term funds are 1120,000. Total long-term funds are 1120,000. It is used to finance 900 fixed asset of rupees 900,000. Fixed asset of rupees 900,000 and remaining of 220,000. And out of the remaining 220,000, all of the permanent current assets, which is 120,000, and 820,000 of the current asset, 120,000 are the permanent level of current asset, 100 is the temporary level of the and the remaining are the temporary current level asset, which is 700,000, is the temporary level of current asset. So all of the permanent current asset 120,000 is financed. Further, the temporary current asset of rupees 700,000. Sorry, 100,000 is financed with the long-term funds, and the remaining 600 fund is financed with the current liability. It is raised with current liabilities. So what actually this approach says? This approach says that all of the long-term funds, 1100 of 20,000, is used to finance the current assets, the fixed assets, plus permanent level of current asset, which is 120,000, and some portion of the temporary current asset. Here the temporary current assets are 700,000, and out of the 700,000, 100,000 is financed with it. So portion of the Total temporary current asset 100,000 is financed with it, and the remaining current asset of rupees 600 are financed with the current liabilities. Thank you very much. This is all from my sides on financing operating current assets.